And now for part 2 in our series in the book of Ruth. We're actually going to pick up the story right where we left off last week. As you know, or as you would know, even if you weren't here, if you've read the story before, Naomi has, as we saw last week, suffered the loss of both her husband and of her 2 sons. And therefore, she has decided to leave Moab. That Naomi and her husband Elimelech and their 2 sons left Bethlehem, where they had lived before. They went to Moab because there was a famine at the time. And now these deaths have occurred, and Naomi has decided to leave Moab and to return to her hometown of Bethlehem and to her extended family there in what, in her mind, she considers to be absolute humiliation but just in humiliation, in her mind. So she has decided to return to Bethlehem, to her extended family there. And we saw Naomi try to convince her 2 daughters-in-law to do the exact same thing, to return back to their families. One of the social safety nets, and it was intended to be a preservation of dignity as well, although it very quickly became a way for human beings to be human beings toward one another. That when a woman is married and she dies or she becomes widowed before she has any children, the cultural norm of the era was then that she would go and return to live among her extended family, among her family of birth, and she of course would be encouraged to wed again because she had behaved honorably and properly and in every way, and just, misfortunes happen. So this is exactly what Naomi is doing. She's returning back to her people in Bethlehem, and she's encouraging her 2 daughters-in-law to do the same thing, to return to their people in wherever it is that they lived in Moab. And of course, we saw that one of them, Orpah, is convinced by her. She returns to her people. But then we also saw last week in Ruth that Ruth chooses not to return. She refuses to leave Naomi. And we marveled at that. We enjoyed it. And that was where we left last week in verse 18. Now we're going to pick up in verse 19, right when this has happened. And I'll read through verse 22 through the end of the chapter. And when I'm finished, I'll say, "This is the word of the Lord." And I invite you at that time, if you would like to respond in faith by saying, "Thanks be to God," you would be welcome to. But listen carefully. We are reading the word of the Lord together in the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verses 19 through 22. So then, the 2 of them went on. This is Ruth and Naomi. The 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred up because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The grass withers and the flower fades, but these words we have read together will endure forever. Well, again, we began to see this last week. We saw the 4 echoes, the beginnings of this theme of Ruth, of the book of Ruth, being a rise from the ashes story. And this rise from the ashes story is one reason why we love this story so much. And we also saw how, I pointed out last week, how kindness is a central theme in this story. But of course, right now in chapter 1, we saw it before in what we read last week, and we see it again here in the gates of Bethlehem, that we saw that this theme of kindness is somewhat lost on Naomi in the moment. We saw the kindness theme beginning very plainly last week in Ruth's beautiful song declaring that wherever Naomi went, there Ruth would go with her, and that Naomi's people would become Ruth's people, and God and Naomi's God would be her God too. And of course, this was all out of love for Naomi, that Naomi has been very kind to Ruth, and now Ruth feels the need to be kind to Naomi. Let's think about this for a moment. Realize the magnitude of what Ruth is deciding. Ruth has never ever left Moab before. She may have never even left her hometown. So she's never been to Israel. She knows nothing of Ruth and Elimelech's people, and she knows nothing of the living God, the one true God, the God of Israel, beyond whatever it is that she has learned and observed while living with Naomi, her husband, and with their two sons. Now, on the other hand, Naomi just cannot see beyond her grief. She cannot see beyond her own grief in this moment. And all she can see is the disintegration of her life. And she cannot even see God moving at this time. In fact, she has what little she can see of God is warped and twisted. You know, a couple of months ago, you might remember a few months ago, we had a series where we journeyed through the book of Job. And we saw in the book of Job how Job's friends assumed that the suffering happening in Job's life was being caused by God on purpose. And Job's friends wrongly assumed that God was punishing Job because Job had committed sins that either Job was unwilling to admit were sins, or that Job was unaware that he had committed. And therefore, because God is a God of justice, that all this calamity that was falling upon Job was Job's own fault. We also saw how that was utterly wrong. In fact, at the very end, we saw God come and speak out of heaven, defending Job and upholding Job's righteousness and scolding his friends for trying to imply that Job had been anything otherwise. Well, I think Naomi, in this moment, again, this is in this moment, we're at the beginning of the story, this is still Act 1, that in this moment that Naomi seems to have fallen into a similar trap, that she thinks that what has happened to her is God's doing, that God has done this to her on purpose. And I think we might be able to empathize with her a little bit, or at least understand how she could feel this way, because, this is a wretched situation that she's in. Anybody who has experienced a death of a parent or a death of a spouse, and anyone who knows anybody, anyone who they themselves have experienced the death of a child or has walked with somebody through that wilderness, knows how easy it is to scream to the heavens, either literally out loud or in your inner monologue, demanding to know, what have I done to deserve this? This is why Naomi has her little soliloquy here. Do not call me Naomi, she insists. The reason she says this is because the word Naomi, translated from the Hebrew, literally means pleasantness, delight, and enjoyment. That's what her name means, is delight, enjoyment, pleasant. Instead, she says, call me Mara, which Mara in Hebrew means bitter. For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. Why call me delight when the Lord has dealt harshly with me? Again, we can understand how, even though it's wrong, we know it's not what's really happening here, but we can understand how in the moment Naomi can believe that God is the one who is causing her ruination. Because even as she even points this out, in an odd irony, Naomi had left Bethlehem originally with an empty stomach, but with a full heart and with a full family. And now, by her estimation, she returns with a full stomach and utterly empty of family and empty in heart. We have no evidence anywhere in this text or in any commentaries outside of the text to imply or to suggest that Naomi's family was anything other than a healthy, loving family and a happy one. Of course, they were populated with humans, and there was typical human brokenness involved, but there was no reason to believe that her family was any more woeful or any more dysfunctional than a typical, otherwise happy, normal family. And now, at least here in chapter 1, it appears as though she has lost it all. So we can understand where she's coming from. But even now, even though Naomi cannot see it, and even though sometimes in our own lives we cannot see it at its beginning, right now, even now in the gates of Bethlehem, and even on the road to Bethlehem, we begin to see the beauty of who God is, the beauty of God's character, and the beauty of the gospel in this story. That even though Naomi can only see her pain, God is proactively already surrounding her with loving kindness. I mean, we saw it, it was plain to see last week in loving, faithful Ruth and her decision and her determination not to be separated from Naomi. And then in this text, this is kind of seeing what isn't there in the text, so to speak, that Ruth and Naomi together have arrived in Bethlehem safe and sound. They have arrived having traveled a number of miles, a considerable distance. They have crossed an international border. And we can guess about what life was like out in the wilderness and on the road in those days before there was a highway patrol keeping people safe. That the fact that they arrived in a manner in which the text makes no mention of any of the events of their journey means that they arrived safe and sound and that the hand of the Lord was there protecting them the entire time. This is one of those no news is good news things. No news is good news. They arrived safe and sound because God's hand of protection was with them as they traveled. And so there's a calling for us in this story as well. There's a calling for us in this episode that we see at the gates of Bethlehem. It's a calling for any who would follow the way of Jesus, and that is a call to active, real, tangible kindness, even when the object of our kindness, the one on whom we are bestowing this kindness, is unaware. We're not being kind in order to receive a thank you. We're being kind because Christ has been kind to us, because God is kind to us. We're kind because that is the way of Jesus. In fact, in Matthew 23, our Lord tells a parable, a very famous parable, the parable of the sheep and the goats. And there is only one difference between the goats who are cast away from God's presence into everlasting fire and the sheep who are welcomed into God's presence and into the kingdom of heaven with hailing and celebration and blessing and words of affirmation. There's only one difference between those sheep and the goats. And that is kindness as behavior, or kind behavior. You have done as much for the least of these, therefore you have done unto me. Or you have not done, even to the least of these, my brethren, therefore you have not done it to me. That's behavior, that's action. That's why St. James emphatically writes that faith without actions is dead. They all believed the same stuff. They all observed the same holy days. They all prayed. They all believed firmly in their hearts that the God of Israel is a real God. They all wanted to follow the way of God, but one group did something and the other group did nothing. If we want to think about it in a more positive light, we can, of course, turn to literature. And you all know that I'm a big fan of The Lord of the Rings. And in this great story of J.R.R. Tolkien's, in book number 3, it's called The Return of the King. Toward the end of the story, there is a big battle scene. If you've seen the movie, you can imagine it in your mind's eye. That's the great shining city of Minas Tirith is under attack from overwhelming forces of goblins, orcs, and evil human beings, all under the power of the Dark Lord Sauron, that they've come from the land of Mordor and they are attacking the city of Gondor, the chief city of Gondor, Minas Tirith. And one of the heroes, Aragorn, who indeed becomes the king later, Aragorn comes in the nick of time with an army that he has found from who knows where. He comes in the nick of time and saves the city from this attack. And after the battle before the gates of Minas Tirith comes to an end, he and his good friend Éomer of Rohan greet one another in front of the gates, and Éomer exclaims, "Twice blessed is help which comes unlooked for." Twice blessed is help which comes unlooked for. Because on the one hand, we are absolutely delighted and we're grateful and we bless the help that we receive. And on the other hand, at the exact same time, we are so grateful that it came in the first place because we didn't know that it would. It was a surprise. And in fact, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, when grace breaks into our lives by surprise. That's what being born again is. When you realize that grace has broken into your life by surprise, and you realize that it's real, and you're ready to place your trust in it and place your weight on that reality. That is being born again of the Spirit. And that is our calling. We, as the followers of Jesus, we are called to be the helpers which come unlooked for. This is why we don't wait for someone who is having a miserable time to ask you if you could come and bring them some lunch, having finally realized that they're just not up to making anything. What do we do instead? We show up. We call them. We say, "Would you like me to bring some lunch? Would you like me to bring a casserole?" You know, we all laugh at the casserole, but casserole is comfort food. You know, we don't just barge into their house and say, "Here, eat my casserole." No, we're nice. Part of kindness is being nice. We call ahead and say, "Would you like some company? Would you like a little something? I have some leftovers that I can bring over." When someone is struggling, they cannot always perceive their need. They're too caught up in their struggle. It's natural. It's a human response. And our call is not always to be the one who fixes the problem. Very often, the ones who actually fix the problem are qualified, highly trained professionals. It could be that we help fix the problem, but even if ours is not the job of fixing the problem, our job is to be proactively kind through that journey. We can be the helpers that come unlooked for a colleague who got passed over for the third time for a promotion. We can be the helper that comes unlooked for a young couple who is despairing of ever having children. We can be the helpers that come unlooked for to our neighbor whose mother has fallen gravely ill. We can be the helpers who come unlooked for to a friend or someone we know who's constantly fighting with their spouse and they just can't seem to resolve whatever the it is. You don't have to be a counselor. You don't have to be a therapist. You're not there to give therapy. You're there to be a friend. Your calling is to be kind. And kindness can come in all manner, shapes, and sizes. We teach our children growing up, we actively teach our children to help others without expectation of reward. That's a good thing that we teach our young ones. The thing that we sometimes forget, though, is that that still applies to us when we grow up. It's not just our kids who help without expectation of rewards, it's us too. When we provide kindness and another person sees it, that's wonderful. That's a very good thing. And in fact, we'll touch on that in detail next week. But even when someone cannot see it, we are still to be kind. Because when the person being helped cannot perceive it, or even when the rest of the community cannot perceive it, when we are proactively kind, even when nobody else can see it, there is someone else who can and who does, and that is our Father in heaven. Our Father in heaven does see our acts of kindness, even when nobody else does, and we store up for ourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust cannot consume, and where thieves cannot break in and steal, and where market volatility cannot erode its value. Brothers and sisters, the bottom line is certainly one of the currencies of God's kingdom, if not the chief currency of God's kingdom, is kindness. Kindness is a currency of God's kingdom. And when all is said and done, then, will we be counted among those who have much or among those who have little? Again, kindness is the currency of God's kingdom. And when all is said and done, will you specifically, and will we together collectively, be found to be those who have much? Or will we be those found to be bankrupt? The choice is yours. The choice is mine. The choice is ours together. And it's a choice that must be made. If you choose not to choose, then you're choosing to be bankrupt. Amen?